The sound is clear. I'm Vladimir Raevsky. I will be facilitating today's section, which we call the public space in this city and the development of social potential. I am an urbanist. I'm not a journalist, and according to my profession, I will be talking about simple things. Which will be the topic of our discussion for this coming 1.5 hours. So, public space is a buzzword among journalists, and for the last 3 and 4 years, and in particular, today's section will be dedicated to the public space as the way of interaction, socializing of people. And as one of the speakers told me before, we can say that they create an amount of social connections between people, communities, and the state and other social categories. And as Moscow is the city of very dense population and very layered and structured population, therefore, we were asking people from different social layers, different of social populations, where shall they meet and interact? Do they need it? And the public domain, public space for them, actually gives the answer to this question, where they can meet, where they can socialize and interact. And Gorky Park is one of the engines of the development of public spaces, proves that this is the way of the interaction, and people from the same stratus meet and collaborate and interact, and the stereotypes and the bias can be shed away. And these city parks and these jogging lanes and open embankments are all those places of hospitality for people which attract them and allow people to make friends, and it actually improves the interaction and the social cohesion between stratas, where people can look not only at each other, but look at what the city is representing for them. And once I remember that the benches were ordered from a city park, the first requirement was for them to be very strong in the anti-vandal, and that was the initial approach to this. And the officials, the bureaucrats, don't understand what kind of people are coming to the recreation areas, and they believe that people come with this metal bars and crash everything on their way, but it is not that way. They should treat us differently, and not all people come immediately with this the destruction purposes. And if we knowingly create these public spaces, then we can actually get away from these misconceptions of bureaucrats and city officials. And then it turned out that we are ready to look into each other's eye. I would like to introduce our today's keynote speakers, and one of them will be Sergei Kopkov, the minister in the government of Moscow and the head of the cultural department. But he is late, and he will come quite soon. But Sergei Zuev, the rector of Moscow Higher School of Social and Economic Sciences and dean of the Faculty of State Management, is next speaker. And Alice Ely is partner for Architecture Bureau, Mayor Architects after of Mayor of London's Housing Design Guide, is also our speaker, and we would like to welcome him. And these are three persons which will be speaking, and then the discussion participants are as follows. Olga Zakharova, she is director of Gorky Park of Leisure and Recreation. And Dan Hill is there, where he is executive director on futures of Future Cities Catapult. Sergei Georgievsky, he is from Center of Territorial Initiatives Arcpolis, and Marina Lilchuk, she is Mosgor Park director. And this is the composition of our experts. I also have several people which will be commenting on the presentations and ask questions. If Sergei Kapkov is not around, then I will give the floor to some of our next speakers. Sergei Kapkov hasn't shown up, then I will ask Sergei Zuev, the rector of Moscow Higher School of Social and Economic Sciences, and he'll speak about what is the social capital and what's the purpose of it. Good afternoon. I wanted to be the third, but I happen to be the first one, so I cannot sit somewhere behind in trenches. But, dear colleagues, I probably have a presentation which is more of philosophical nature, and I expected somebody from a practical mindset. Therefore, I can actually kind of apprehensive about just being suspended in my philosophizing, but still we have some practical aspect in our discussion, and I will be using some social data whose authors are a number of experts working in my school, and therefore I need to tell that this is not just my concoctions, but something which has some sociologic empirical basis. And if we have some particular conclusions, then they are based on something solid and substantiated. So why I'm talking about social capital? The modern cities, which is compatible and successful, is the place where we have a continuous confrontation of a number of capitals across each other. I mean, if we talk about this, the history of 200 and 300 centuries ago, it will be a confrontation of trade and kind of other capital. But the modern city and the megalith city of today is the place where different types of capital, of assets, social, economic, information, and fiscal ones, turn into each other, and that is actually my hypothesis. And proceeding from them, I would like to perceive Moscow, which, according to all international ratings, is among the 20 most strongest cities in the world. By its economic potential, definitely. And we can argue about whether this kind of Moscow's economy is successful or not efficient or less efficient, but still it is among the first 20 cities. And among other international ratings whose objectivity can be questioned or discussed, they still come to the same conclusion that by the quality of life, the quality of environment, we are in the 6th or 7th dozen of modern cities, and this is a great disparity between the current potential and its conversion into the quality of life, the quality of environment, the quality of infrastructure. And the situation is clear. And it's clear to the management of the city, to experts, to residents of it, and something is being done with this regard, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but still we don't see this direct conversion of different types of capitals to the extent we see the conversion of the financial capital into the industrial one, which are so important for the development of the city. More of it. I can say that the further gap between the economic potential of the city and the quality of environment will lead to some unforeseen consequences, including social ones, and like brain flight and so on. Because people with certain qualification, even if they receive a huge salary, but they cannot provide good education for their children or some improper healthcare services, they will migrate from here. And this is what I'm talking about. So different assets transfer and flow into each other, and then we can see the transformation of social capital into financial one. So these contacts which belong to certain player in the of the city can easily be converted in some economic assets, and the cultural asset can transform into a political one. And a political asset can also get transformed into something else. So the modern city, is a place or a range of infrastructures where different types of assets transfer into each other, and this is kind of a stock exchange, a kind of market where we have this which is limited by certain boundaries, and the better the city can convert these assets, the better the city is. And this is my proposition, which I actually put forward, and which is very relevant to social capital. Why we talk about social capital? Because these infrastructures like information and public meeting venues or centers of where the different social and expert groups congregate, then they are only possible when we have enough space for the social capital. And I believe that social capital is the level of trust between different players. If people and institutes and different structures, businesses and the state, or some individuals and schools, for instance, or healthcare providers, if they have this interconnectivity, if they have this trust, then this conversion happens. And it doesn't resolve all issues of the modern development, but I'm deeply convinced that this is the departure point for understanding whether the city is a world capital, whether it is compatible, because it can be actually a capital, but it will not be perceived as the international capital. And some peoples have this sufficient capital behind it, but they don't act as a capital. So the very notion of capital needs to be redefined. And now about the technological approach to it. Yes, we are talking about level of trust and social capital. Trust, I underscore it, but I am a representative of social sciences, and this is my limitation. In social sciences, we have different approaches of this social trust, and it can become interpersonal domain. But we also have kind of delineation of the relations between people and institutes, and whether we trust our own healthcare system or our education system. Do we trust our management system in the city, and do they trust us? So, coming back to the social findings which my colleagues received, we see that in Moscow we have only one connection works very well. The trust in your peers, and the trust into other city institutions is less than 50%. You can judge it from your experience, but a trust to unknown person is the minimal, and we believe it's disastrous. And our research also demonstrates that a level of mistrust to others rises to 100%. It especially topical for mono cities, those cities which depend on one large enterprise, and there the mistrust of any other person can reach 100%, and level of trust to institutes also vary. And another point, the effect of what we call effect of Dagestan effect. They use this happiness index in this survey, and in the Republic of Dagestan, one of the most backward in economical sense republic by the happiness index is leading. And once again, happiness index, the trust in tomorrow, this confidence in tomorrow, and the confidence in those who are around you doesn't depend on your income. It does depend, but if you are behind the poverty level. But later you see some interesting things if you are above this level. And in my questionnaire we say in what time you need to collect some particular amount of money urgently among your friends. In Dagestan, they say, I need 1 or 2 days to collect a sum with some several thousand dollars, I believe. Or in other cities, it's not like this, and it works across all Russian regions, except to certain areas. And in this field, I believe that the harmony, our well-being is determined by this type of social capital. It's the trust of your near ones. We don't go to the bank to take a loan. We go to our relatives and we just borrow from them. A Russian citizen, an average Russian person, will easily actually leases this certain amount of money to their friends, and it happens quite often. And still we have some gaps at the level of institutional trust, at the level of social coherence, and I still state that conversion of assets cannot work if we have this level of mistrust. In order to make it work, we need to eliminate these deficiencies in the area of tolerance. And it's the separate issue is to address the migration policy, social policy, or address the issues of youth. And we have a tremendous, disastrous attitude to the enforcement and state infrastructures. So, dear colleagues, whatever we say and whatever success we have at some spots, if we don't have the infrastructure of conversion, the social trust into other assets, we will have no future. Thank you very much.
Sergey, thank you very much. And here we have Sergei Alexandrovich, Sergei Katkov, the minister of the Moscow government and the head of the culture department. He was supposed to be our first speaker. And now I can give the floor to you, or what would you prefer? I would like to share a couple of observations, and I would also like to share our view on the codification of the social and public space, and why do we believe that a public space has utmost importance for the city development, and especially as far as such a big city as Moscow is concerned. For several years, we have been living with the idea that people work in the city, people live in the city, and the public space is the only space which people can believe is belonging to them, apart from their apartment. But their apartments are quite small, so the public space is the place where you spend considerable part of your life, considerable part of your time. And sometimes traveling in Moscow takes from 2 to 3 hours for an average Moscovite. So here on this slide, we can see the breakdown of the categories of people who tend to participate in the social life of Moscow. So normally, young parents, the urban professionals, as we call them. So in other words, those people who pay taxes, who have a job, who earn money, and who tend to have certain requirements to both political power and political system and to the system of municipal governance. So in other words, these are the people who form the agenda of our city. So, and as we can see, more than 85% of Muscovites visit these public spaces together with their kids, together with their friends. So this is a place to socialize. And I was astonished to see that 7% of the family income, on average, is being spent on cultural events, and only 2% are being spent for education. And that differentiates us a lot from the European countries and from the United States, for example. And in these countries, all extra income is being spent on personal development. So people will be developing themselves to explore the new capabilities, which will then give them a better opportunity to earn more money. So next slide, please. Who Muscovites trust the most? 24% of Muscovites do not trust anyone, and they are probably right in doing so. 38% trust only their close relatives, and this is why all these social networks and social connections are really, really important for us. So when we do something really well, then people tend to share their experiences and their observations, and this is how we find out about all these good things. And a couple of years ago, Gorky Park was ranked as one of the was ranked in the top 20 of the places of power in Moscow, and now it is ranking amongst the top 10. And under the Instagram version, it ranks among the top 10 places of power, together with the Eiffel Tower and the Red Square. So in other words, this is the place where people tend to take their pictures and post them in social networks. So talking about the urban public spaces, I would say that it is important to make sure that these public spaces are comfortable and they are well developed, because that also contributes to development of the social capital. 75% of Muscovites, as statistics say, at least once a month tend to go to one of Moscow parks. So all in all, the park attendance is 27 million people a month. Though this is an average estimate, like an estimate of an average spend per store, but it just highlights the potential in terms of rent, in terms of equipment rent and everything else. So 27 million people attending parks on a monthly basis. So we invest into development of these parks, we invest into proper bases and into benches, into lighting and everything else. So when you have the right infrastructure, then the social culture will develop by itself. So before we didn't have we didn't have places for workout, didn't have places for skating or skateboarding, and now we have dozens of these places all around Moscow. And believe me, it's not very expensive for the city to create that infrastructure, but it has immense positive effect. 27 million people a month attend parks, and they all have something to do apart from just hanging around and taking a look at the stage where somebody is performing something. So we are trying to actively involve people into all these activities, and here is our statement. Moscow is the city that lives, works, and creates. This is the city in which our people are looking for entertainment, but they're also looking for some public space in which they can express themselves on their own. So we started with creating infrastructure. Then we tried to involve or tried to start some activities there. We contact the workout fans or football fans or chess fans or dancing fans, whatever. We try to involve them and we invite them into this public space. One of the important elements of park development is creating communities in these parks. Never mind what these communities are about. It might be a jogging community or Scandinavian walk club or some intellectual club or yoga community or something else. Let's say an Eastern philosophy community, for example. So we believe that this public space should foster cooperation between people, should foster interaction between them. So it fosters it encourages them to report that they are being here, they are being present in this well-developed place, and now we can see these things, and we can see these parks and bits of infrastructure even in our cinemas, and it is good to know that this public space is expanding and is making its way into media, into history, and into the cinema. And I believe that they will become part of the image, as, for example, these high-story buildings have become an image and a symbol of Khrushchev times, for example. So Muscovites, as any other people and any other inhabitants of a big city, they have their phobias. So they tend to be afraid of taking a walk in the downtown at nighttime. 18% believe that this is dangerous, or taking a walk in the outskirts of the city. But believe me, the level of crime in the downtown and in the outskirts tends to be quite similar, because crime is also evolving following its own pattern, and crime tends to concentrate around such facilities like malls, or casinos. So you can say that some location at the outskirts of the city is more dangerous or more unsafe as compared to the downtown. So the sense of security and the sense of safety, this is what we tried to measure. We also tried to measure it together with the level of trust that people feel in different districts of the city. So here on this slide, in the left part of it, you can see those people who, or the districts which inhabitants believe that the city environment is quite unsafe. And also on the right side of the slide, you can see that the other districts, which inhabitants believe that they can trust basically anyone in the street. And this year we have already made 5 pilot projects. We have changed the profile of our clubs and culture houses. These are big facilities, 2,500 meters of floor space, and we have converted them into social centers which will now perform some cultural functions and educational functions, like there will be lectures right there, and there will be different communities operating, like dancing communities, and the Moscow cities will have tours around Moscow and will be performing at those stages. So this is the reason why we have started to develop these projects, not only in the downtown, but also in the outskirts of the city. So we are decentralizing the infrastructure of this public space, and creating more public facilities and public spaces helps to change the profile of a certain district. And normally all these places are designed, I'll be frank with you, by European architects. So, and these facilities and these spaces, they don't look like spaces from Moscow, and people tend to feel themselves proud about it because they like the way these parks look, they like the way these urban places and urban spaces look. We have 2 really good parks, the Sadovniki Park, or the Garden Park, and the Lilac Garden Park. So it was designed by these same architects, by the British Architectural Bureau, which designed the Olympic Park in London, for example. And our survey says that people in these areas would tend to be mistrustful of our law enforcement system, and they had certain phobias, and they didn't trust that the environment is safe. They didn't believe that they could trust those people who they meet in their own district. But we see now that these figures are changing gradually, and the situation is improving. So also we have, let's say, in these areas we have low satisfaction with the environmental position, even though that this assessment is not quite objective, as the actual environmental situation there is better than in the downtown of the city. But getting back to Sadovniki Park, or the Gardeners Park, in terms of the infrastructure and in terms of the development level, it is a well-developed public space, and it is well ahead of any Russian park and any Moscow park as far as its development and design is concerned. This is something that has been designed and built from scratch, and this is the public space which takes up several, from 10 to 20 hectares. And it is an excellent park. It's more than just a park. It is a cluster of cultural activities, which includes some tennis courts, and it also includes the skate park. So when we just designed it, the skate park was meant to be the biggest skating park in Moscow. It was designed together with our experts from Germany and St. Petersburg. So when we just designed it, skating was not the part of the culture of those people who lived around the park. Now, the skating park can boast great attendance, and a lot of people who live in the vicinity of this park tend to go in for skating. So there are also some other sports facilities in the park which are quite popular among young people and elderly people as well. Each of these parks have a web page and social networks. They have their own community, they have hashtags, and they form a certain agenda. And a year ago, we have adopted the development standard for Moscow Park, and following this standard, any park who has similar area as Gorky Park should also have the same level of infrastructure. There should be facilities for children. These parks should be fitted for people, for disabled people, and in many parks we have quite extensive facilities for kids, from 2 to 4 hectares per park, and these facilities are used by young parents. These are facilities for kids who are younger than 10 years old and facilities for kids over 10 years old. So, and in some cases, these are standalone projects. In our view, this public space fosters cooperation and communication between people. A lot of people go to the parks to meet their peers, to have a feel for the people who live in the city, and to experience the city, and to meet the person from the social networks, to have a feeling that you're not alone in this big city, in this big space. I think that there is a lot of demand for development of public spaces, also because the type of activities which can be promoted in these parks is really interesting for various social groups, for various people with different level of income, and our leisure activity and the leisure activity that we provide in this park, they develop people. So regardless of how much money you earn, you can participate in this dancing activity on the Crimea embankment, and these sites are visited by even big entrepreneurs, because that promotes this interactive feeling of Moscow. And this is our way to assure people that Moscow provides you equal capabilities for development and self-development, and provides you with opportunities. And Moscow is living, working, and creating things. It is understanding people, and it trusts people. Thank you very much.
Sergei Alexandrovich, many thanks, and we heard the view of social capital and public area as the way to accumulate it of a scientist, of a manager, and Alex Ali from May Architects will speak about the practical things.
I want to start with the premise that the success of public space and its ability to promote social capital is dependent on how well designed it is. In our research, Places for Strangers, we propose the notion that good space, good well-designed public space and buildings engender a sense of identity and a sense of connectivity with the people who use them. So in the next 10 minutes, I want to explore 3 types of public space. The residential street. I think public space starts at our front door. The neighbourhood street and the civic street. We plan our cities as if in a helicopter. Many of our cities, 3 depicted here, they could be anywhere, they illustrate very similar kinds of public spaces, a network of connected streets, boulevards, public squares and parks. And often at this sort of level they look very similar. But the success of a public space is down to how well we design it at eye level, at 5 kilometres per hour as we walk the street. At street level, that's how we need to consider the design of public realm. And it's the uniqueness of these kind of spaces that gives cities their uniqueness and their difference. If we start with the pedestrian experience, we get a more attractive, healthier cities, more livable cities, rather than just planning around the car, around infrastructure and around public transport. We need to get down to the local level. So I'm going to start with an estate regeneration scheme that we're realising in London. It's a modernist housing estate from the 1950s. And it fulfilled all the ambitions of the time, but actually what it failed to deliver was good public space. These are the sort of conditions found in the estate. You have buildings that turn their back onto the street, that have no connection and no relation to public space. Residents don't comfortably want to walk out into these spaces or dwell and linger in these sort of spaces. But the great thing about an estate like this is you've got a constituent of residents that are willing and engaged to talk to you. So I think the success of public space, the success of building social capital, is as much about engagement with the people who are going to use those spaces. And we work considerably when developing master plans, when undertaking architectural commissions. We always try and work with the people who are going to be using our buildings or our spaces. We try and engage the citizens through workshops, through exhibitions, through forums, and have a dialogue about what it is they want, rather than coming in with our preconceived ideas that often led to the failure of the estates and the housing developments that we're pulling down. So our approach here on this estate, if I can move forward, is really to look back at history, in actual fact. It's to rethink a neighbourhood as a series of connected streets, as public squares, as community gardens. Really in much the same way that our towns and cities developed over time, but often modernist principles and utopian ideas did away with. So looking at this scheme, we've got different densities of housing, we've got towers, we've got mansion blocks, we've got terrace housing, low-rise and high-rise. But they all are configured to have a good relationship to the streets and squares that we're creating. We move on to the next slide. We've got images of the sort of local conditions that we're trying to create. Can we move on to the next image? Seems to have stalled. Well, if I just talk through this one, you see in the middle we've got a public square, but then also between the residential dwellings we've got local gardens, which the residents themselves can use, which aren't accessible to the wider public, but hopefully the local residents will take charge of and manage and look after. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So some views of how the street will look at a local level, with play areas, with landscape gardens and so on. And then if we move to the neighbourhood level, moving out to a larger picture, the second scenario is the sort of public spaces that make up neighbourhoods and where we plan for different land uses and different networks. This is a 400-hectare site at the edge of Copenhagen, which is going to be one of the largest urban extensions. It's going to accommodate 4 million square metres of new buildings, 40,000 new jobs. And when planning this in a competition, we started by asking ourselves what it is that people want within a local neighbourhood. Again, sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to move forward. Thank you. What do people want to be able to walk to in terms of facilities, local shops, local play areas, local bus and public transport connections, and what are they prepared to go a bit further for, to 10 minutes, 15 minutes, to local schools, healthcare facilities and the like. And once you kind of develop a picture of what people's needs and wants are, then you can start master planning. So this neighbourhood developed around 2 district centres in red and 3 local neighbourhood centres in blue. And each one of those accommodated different kinds of functions, different kinds of public space. But underpinning that development, next slide, we developed a set of design codes that regulated the quality of those public spaces and those buildings, but also a citizens' charter that would provide the governance structure to make sure that those public spaces are well maintained, well looked after, which covers conditions and requirements about natural habitat and wildlife, managing waste, cultural identity and cohesion, but also reducing environmental pollution. Finally, the third kind of public space I want to talk about is our civic spaces. Civic and cultural buildings, as in my mind, form an extension of the public realm. They form an extension of our streets and spaces. And this is our proposal for a new museum of art and architecture in Oslo. This is a website where you can see that they promote exhibitions on art and architecture. They have permanent and temporary exhibitions, but it's also a forum for lectures, for events and debates. And in that space, it's very much a sort of public space in the old Greek agora sense of the word. So the plan you can start seeing has a relationship on the right-hand side, the town hall, with its external public space. But in our new building on the left, we wanted to bring the public space right up and into and through the building, onto the roof, into the public spaces, into the internal spaces. So the diagram on the right gives you a sense that actually the street is moving up through the building, both north and south and east and west. And again, on the left-hand side in the plan, you get the sense that the landscape seamlessly runs in to the building. And again, colonnades, covered walkways, streets and squares both sit outside and within the building. And then as you arrive finally inside the building, on the next image, you get a reference back to the city, the relationship of cultural institution and in the distance the town centre, the civic administrative heart of government, and the sort of dialogue that goes on between our municipal authorities and our cultural provision. So just finally, how might we actually start measuring the quality of design in public space? Vitruvius, the Roman scholar, talked about commodity, firmness and delight. Buildings and public spaces need to function well and be designed for purpose. They need to be of good quality in terms of their build and finishes, so they're built to last. And they need to manage impact, so they need to promote social capital, need to have character and identity, and also be inclusive and accessible. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, Alex. Thank you, Alex.
So, also, our session is being attended by our experts who will participate in this discussion. Olga Zakharova is the director of Gorky Park, and Gorky Park has become a symbol of communication between people and of communication between various groups of people, like, for example, the blue berets, the people from airborne troops, and normally you wouldn't want to touch them when they are celebrating their anniversary, but in the Gorky Park you can interact with them. So how has the development of the Gorky Park influenced the enhancement of the social capital? Park Gorkova, the Gorky Park. In the Gorky Park, we try to study what's happening with the people, we try to capture the development trends, and we also take a look at how our infrastructure performs. When we get the kids site or workout site, we try to measure attendance, we try to take a look which types of activity people tend to like the most. So we base our judgment first on what people want, and also we embark on some innovational concepts, and we use international experience. Because if we base our plans on what people want all the time, then we would be in the same situation as we found ourselves 4 years ago when we asked people the question, what do you want to see in the Gorky Park? And 90% of people asked us to get all this roller coaster activity back into the Gorky Park. But that happened only because people had no idea that there are other ways to spend their time. I think that we should look back all the time whilst walking forward, and we should think of something which prevents our green territories, which makes a park a park. And so our park is the place where you can have a lot of entertainment, and there is a lot of places where you can have some food. And people tend to get smarter about their leisure activity. People need to get more and more pleasure just out of being outside. You don't need to be entertained during your leisure time. If you take a look at the European parks, you will see that people are not being entertained there by somebody. And in Hyde Park or in Central Park or in Millennium Park in Chicago, you don't have that many scheduled and planned activities. Then there is not a lot of places where you can eat, for example. But in our parks, the situation is different. We are different. So, I mean, you still have to entertain people because they're waiting for it. I don't think that we should passively follow the trend. I think that we should be riding this wave and coming up with options which will be comfortable for people. And people should feel themselves comfortable regardless of whether there is some activity scheduled in the park or not. So the quality of their rest and recreation will be driven by the quality of the environment. If the place is clean, if there is enough light, if the place is safe, then you will feel yourself comfortable there. If there is a bench where you can rest, if you are surrounded by birds and trees, then you will feel yourself happy. I think that's quite enough. We also have Dan Hill here, an urban development expert from London. I would like to ask him a question. When you design a public space in Great Britain, do you take social capital into account in the course of this design? And do you forecast the influence of the designed public space on the social capital?
It's slightly awkward talking this way and that way simultaneously, so I'll just look this way. I think Alex gave a great talk about how it's done in the UK. I mean, that was almost an example of best practice work around urban development. I think I'd prefer to talk about something slightly different in a way, which is almost the reverse of what this session is, which the subtitle for the session, I think, was how do we use public space to generate social capital? I guess the next thing I'm interested in is how do we use social capital to generate public space. So how does the engagement of the community develop new kinds of ideas for public space? And this in some sense builds on what we just heard around Gorky Park. And we understand that there's this dialogue between, in a sense, what the public wants and then what can be done. And in other design trades beyond architecture and urban design, such as industrial design or interaction design or service design, we've understood for a long time that you can't just ask people what they want, because people aren't very good at saying what they want, and they don't know what to ask for that they didn't know existed. So when the iPod was invented, no one asked, would you like the iPod? Would you like 1,000 songs in your pocket? No one knows that's possible. So you do ethnographic research, deep user research, the kind of studies and engagements that I think also Alex was talking about. And from that emerges the possibility of something like an iPod, and then it's developed in iteration and constant user feedback and so on. That's a very, very different approach. And I think we have to get well beyond this idea of architecture as it used to be, which was something that was done to people around public space, and then the idea of consultation, which is basically the same thing, as in we have an idea, what do you think about it, which isn't really a massive step forward, and of course people always respond negatively to that. You quite often get a not in my backyard reaction, or again the idea that, well, we don't know what exists, so we'll fall back on something that we know does exist, like a roller coaster. So I'm more interested in the possibility of blank spaces. I really like, actually, also in relation to the previous comment, or this idea that the Mexican writer Valeria Luiselli has, which she talks about relingos, which is a space in the city which is unplanned and empty, essentially, but therefore, as a result, is full of possibility, because it can be many, many, many things. And the question is, well, how do people enable that? How do they activate that space? So not people, again, using a space, but activating it themselves. If you make a roller coaster there, you can only really use it as a roller coaster. It's totally monofunctional. If it's an empty space, it's actually far more full of possibility than a roller coaster, which is what's interesting, again, about what Gorky Park is doing. So the next phase for me is then, how do citizens themselves begin to engage in activating public space? They can't often do that at the scale of a park. So what we're seeing in the world is often using digital platforms, but not exclusively, because there's no such thing as digital and physical. They're all blurred into one, essentially, now. People beginning to crowdsource or organize around or build consensus around ideas for small-scale developments in cities. Far more interesting, with all due respect, than parks, actually, because parks are large things which take careful planning. I'm kind of interested in green infrastructure at the scale of this stage, or something smaller than this, and how that's threaded through and woven into urban developments, so that we don't have this old modernistic idea of a city as a series of industrial spaces, residential spaces, and then a park, which is in some sense the guilt of the other spaces. It's the thing we do to make the other spaces okay, in a sense. We kind of let the other spaces off the hook as a result. They don't have to be green because we have a big park over here. I'm much more interested in how we make everything green and blue to some degree with multifunctional spaces. That can only be done with active engagement from citizens from day one. In fact, it needs to be their idea. Still needs to go through planning and architecture and a collaborative process, but nonetheless, it's a complete asymmetry. It's a complete reversal of the decision-making process and the power process. Again, architects are involved, planners are still involved, cities, governments are still involved. But often with the small-scale things, citizens can do an awful lot themselves. And you see that in Schönberg in Berlin. You see that to some extent with the High Line in New York, which is a citizen-led project at scale. You see it around the redevelopment of Constitucion in Chile after the earthquake there, and so on and so on. So, like a politician, I ignored your question. But I wanted to bring it out of the previous comments around the park and say, well, what is green in the city that isn't the park? And how do we use social capital, people themselves that are empowered in a way to make decisions about what that might be, and how does that happen? Because we now have huge opportunities there in that front, I think.
Спасибо. Также здесь присутствует Сергей Георгиевский, партнер Центра территориальных инициатив «Архполис». Я так понимаю, что «Архполис» активно занимается регенерацией пространств паркового назначения. Вообще, раз у нас разговор об общественных пространствах так дал крен в сторону парков, ну пусть это так и будет. У нас всего 1,5 часа на эту дискуссию отведено, поэтому мы уже останемся здесь. Так вот, Ольга Захарова затронула интересную тему, насколько следует...
And she said, to what extent we have certainly, apologize for, we need to take into account to what extent we need to follow the wishes of the citizens, what their parks should be. It is an issue which is quite confrontational. You see, to one extent, we transform the public space and we introduce something new, and then we change the mindset of people and those they see and what the new reality, and they form some new demands, new needs, and at the same time, local communities need to participate and contribute to those changes which happen in parks. Therefore, a modern citizen generally is ready to participate in the changes in the modernization of the cities and parks. Previously, they didn't. You said that they are ready now, and say we are talking about Gorky and Sokolniki Park. Yeah, well, we see the consciousness level and the level of your citizenship participation is getting more mature. And therefore, people are ready to participate. And here the main issue is a compromise between this involvement of citizens to modernization and at the same time the attempt to instill new culture, to open new horizons for people, to show them what can be different from what used to be. Because Moscow is a capital of international significance, and we cannot have the values all the time which used to be dominant in the past. Therefore, we spoke about these outlying areas of Moscow, and we see that in Mitina Park, people become active contributors to the changes which are underway. I will leave away the Gorky Park because I'm not that competent in the presence of the director, but I can compare Sokolniki and Mitina. One is 5 kilometers away from the Kremlin, and another one is behind the ring road. But the level of involvement and readiness to improve it in Mitina Park, which is behind, is the highest in the city, right? So Olga gave us an excellent example of the modernization of Gorky Park, and we asked what citizens want to see there. They said we need an amusement park. And what about your park? You want something else in your park? We always ask residents, the local communities, and we would like them to be the customers and of the order. But do you actually feel the change in their needs? Environment, this is what the people are mostly conscious, and they want to preserve the elements of nature which exist in parks, but at the same time they have a better content in the park. I mean, because there are some different needs, but quite often we see from the public, and it's interesting to correlate it with Gorky Park. They say, we don't want it to be worse than in Gorky Park, although we want to have the same. We want to deserve the same quality. So we can say that we have a unique solution to this question. Margichuk is from Moscow Park, and what's your take about the infrastructure in the park? This entertainment, the catering service, and amusement centers. What is your priority? You see, our visitors, they become more, sophisticated, and we do public hearing, and we also use the active citizen application for smartphones, and we see that the opinions differ, and some people vote for a playing ground, some others would say a place to walk their dogs. And we try to find a compromise, and we improve the area in general. Then we invite experts who can help it, and then when we have ready solutions, we ask the communities, the representatives, the deputies, which are authorized by the voters, and they find this compromise. Do people know how to entertain themselves? Yes, they are quite active, and they have great desire to participate, and Mitina Park is one of the examples of it. Most of the local residents from nearby buildings, they are all eager to participate in discussions. Definitely today it is very popular even, and they started to trust the management of the park. Previously they didn't, and they always suspected that they will build some business center there. That's definitely, yeah, sure, but these days they're much more uh, uh, more trustful, and they know that their opinion will be taken into account. Is it correct that those remote outlying parks differ in the value? We can say that at Sadovniki Park we have a tremendous park, but it has no cultural facilities there. And when we started to improve it and build children grounds, playing grounds, then we immediately saw rising demand. And the young people from sitting next to their houses moved to the park and started to play sports at sport grounds. It reduced also uh, the crime rate even, and I said that yes, when we have facilities, I told you about the benches, and people first need was to that they should be very robust and withstand some vandal acts. And those vandalism, does it affect you much? Is it the issue for you? Well, I can say that in central parks we don't see vandalism. You see, people got has changed actually, but those outlying parks, we see those instances, and you can build a bench and then it disappears at night. People are not well educated, but it takes time, I believe, and it will be better, and people will treat these issues better. In central parks, we don't see instances. In Sadovniki, in Sirenivy Sad gardens, when we placed all these bronze sculptures, and then we saw that 10 benches disappeared. It was history, but we need people to get used to having values placed in the parks. And Sergei Zuev, as a researcher, can you say, you spoke about the happiness index, right? When people are ready to collect, say, 100,000 rubles in 1 or 2 days, and in Dagestan this rating is the highest. I have never been to the city of Makhachkala, but I believe that these parking areas are less quickly developed than in Moscow. But to what extent this happiness index is related to parking areas, especially for large cities like ours? The answer is simple. Now we actually have to stick to the traditional ways of socializing, and most in the situation of uncertainty, traditional communities survive better, right? And definitely they are using the resources which are historically inherited, and this their kind of tribe or this extended families, and those are great values they have, and or we cannot lose. But there are some other channels now, apart from them, which also contribute to growing social capitals. And which is tremendously important now, as my friend, mayor of one Latin American city said, why parks? It is with my Gini quotient. We have built a place where a millionaire can make a person with some average or below average income. So this is the area where they can meet, and it is needed apart from this relative or connections and say our attitude to migrants, to unknown people, can also change there. Therefore, most happy are those people who preserve the traditional forms of communication. But if you manage to uncork these channels of public energy and reestablish the level of trust to each other, a level of trust to certain institutes, this urban process and urban environment and competitiveness of the city will be much higher. So far, one of my friends once told me that family has three features: the common economy, common house, and common bed. But if we have only two features out of three, the family is there. But here, out of three features, we have only one. Traditional connections with your nearby people, relatives, but it doesn't create a family. And when we start trusting our own healthcare system, then the situation will be much better. So when people trust each other, unknown people, then it will be immediately a qualitative change in parks and public spaces, and what we have now in libraries and what our museums are turning into. We will reestablish the second feature of a family. And there are some third element, but it is a topic of a particular discussion. But we have Gorky Park and some other parks, good parks like Metina, and people go there and they know it is secured and clean and can safely meet and socialize and make friends. But at the same time, the number of guards in Moscow is not going down. How to overcome this? And say in park you can feel safe, but when we go somewhere else, then we lose a feeling of you see, community, or kind of how to spread the social capital beyond these public areas. Well, this is quite a sophisticated issue, which cannot be resolved by a number of policemen or guards or a number of educated people. In parks, it happens, we have a format, a style of behavior, and this is a Moscow identity, and there is no shameful about it. And if a guard comes to somebody and says it is not common to do so in the park, so it is already good a kind of behavioral tool, and say a person can just bring a blanket and sit on the grass and it's fine. So, and in 3 years we grew up an audience which considers these places as the common one, the a place where they like spending time, and it's not just a green gardens behind the fence. This is the city territory, and it is not that complicated to do. And people are much better than we sometimes talk about. And those who break benches, these are not the people which frequently come there. This is aggression of people who don't feel that this place, it doesn't belong to them. They don't belong to this place, I believe. And those who take care of this park will never do it. People are better than we think. This is also I share. And people who live in Moscow sometimes are tired and under daily stress because of the traffic jams and for working hard, and they really hard to work hard, and some of them get good salary or not that good. But this is the space for self-realization, and but people are flexible, adaptable, and they start to appreciate this, and it becomes part of their habit. And I can say that from tomorrow on, I can stop working at all or stop working with parks, but because now we know what Moscow Park is. We now this big urban forum explain what a Moscow Park is. You see, we cannot change this trend, even if you don't have a tremendous budget anymore. But I believe these parks have their own potential already. And if somebody wants to build a business center in the Gorky Park, it will never happen, because not only people who come to the park will protest, and people living nearby, they're not in this room. We don't know even about existence. They will come and say, this is our place, we will protect it, and we will save it. So a park is the place of democracy, and the ways to protect democracy is different, and the gardeners also do it. But if people believe they are masters of this territory, you cannot take it away from them.
В сессиях происходит очень ограниченное время.
So, as always at these sessions, we are pressed for time, and we have a panel of experts who attend this session. They are here, and Pavel Nefedov wants to comment on this. And keep in mind the fact that we don't have a lot of time. Sorry, the speaker is speaking off the mic. Well, first and foremost, I want to express my belief and confidence that Vydien Park will be discussed with the same level of detail next year as we are discussing Gorky Park today. But what is the difference between this VDNH Park, between the standard park? This difference is not taken into account quite often, but VDNH is not just a park. It's a cluster of different pavilions, which historically have become the key, let's say, part of this federation. That these pavilions were the most important component of the exhibition. And before, in the Soviet times, these pavilions, they tend to host a group of activities. They had their own agenda. They interacted actively with the public. They actively interacted with different stratas of Soviet society. And this leads us back to the subject of our discussion, which is social capital. As we have seen in the previous years, this B2B functionality of this park is not demanded any longer. But these pavilions can become communication centers for the public. Before, they used to perform a number of functions like educational function, and they were open. They existed in the public space. And they remain in the public space now, but these pavilions are now empty. And I do believe that the new concept of development, which is emerging now, will bring new life into this park. And it will help us to create new layer of life in these pavilions. So people would go there, and they would go to a specific pavilion in full knowledge that there is something happening there which is interesting. Now they only tend to go to the Polytechnical Museum, and Polytechnical Museum exhibition is currently housed in one of the pavilions. But in future, I think, if we can create a space where a space which will be interesting for you specifically. And if that can be done, if that space can be created in the VDNH Park, that will be interesting, I think. Pavel, thank you very much. And we have talked about the park being the space for democracy, but we've only 10 minutes left, so there is a time only for two questions. I'm coming from, my name is Varvara, and I'm coming from Omsk, from City Planning and Development Institution. So we were working on issues of urban development, but the question is, why are we only talking about the parks when we mention public spaces? Because a public space is a number of elements. That includes the closed public spaces, the pedestrian areas, and Alex has pointed it out quite rightly. So, and that also relates to a number of issues, to the social culture, and I think that we tend to have a very closed look and very limited look on the concept of the public space, because we also need to take yards into account. So what do we do with the public space that starts right outside, which is right outside of our blocks of apartments? This is the situation which we have in St. Petersburg. This is an area when there is an overlap of interests, of private interests and social interests. Well, you're right in what you're saying. But then we need to define who takes the ownership of the public space in the city. So there has to be some organization. But if you talk about the yards of the block of apartments, then the utilities department is responsible for this, but utility department will never tend to have the same look as you do at the public space. So cultural department is now in charge of boulevards, parks and pedestrian areas. When we have just taken this area of responsibility over, we only had around 20 parks. Now we have about 100. And this is not because we are very good in doing the politics, but when mayor of Moscow visits different districts, the people from these districts say that we want a park, and we have to meet these demands. So, but when we start talking about other areas, like yards or adjacent territory of the blocks of apartments, now we also have to take into account security and parking and everything else. Then I would say that our social dialogue is not up to this standard yet. But taking, you're right in what you're saying, and if we take a look at the master plan of Paris, then the master plan was ordered by the Department of Culture, because the key question was, what is the value that Paris has to present to the world? And they tried to answer it in this way. Omsk is very different from Moscow. So once you define the concept of your city, once you understand what is the value of your city, then you can start to develop public spaces. If the territory adjacent to the block of apartment is also a public space, then it has to be recognized as such. But the question was about systemic approach to this, like the type of a master plan or an already standardized design project which would allow for proper organization of the public spaces. And that could also bring more identity, will give a city more identity. Unfortunately, we're not very good in taking these holistic and systemic approaches to things in Russia. So when we talk about park, there is always a border. There is always a border between the park and the city. So we tend to set the rules ourselves, but if we reconcile these rules with what the public wants, then we have a successful project. I think that we can change the state of things on the basis of the social dialogue.
Interesting debate, and I think cities worldwide always have a problem with the availability of finance to pay for improvements in local public spaces. The parks evidently attract tourists. They're a great facility, as you say, they're a democratic space, but then how do you invest in local yards, as you call them, the streets and squares, as we define them in London? And I think what we're seeing in certain cities, and it's very new in areas in London, is the new civic economy, where people are empowered, citizens are empowered to actually take control of local areas, local yards, and create orchards or allotments or play areas for their children. Because ultimately, if you want to take your children out to play, you don't want to travel for half an hour, you want to walk 2 minutes outside your house. And I think if we can empower and engender local communities to take control of those spaces, then we can work collectively to deliver better public space.
Господин Хилл.
Mr. Hill, any comments from your side?
I think the question is, well, when do you need to make a rule about it as well? When does it need to be a decision that the municipality takes? And so following on from this comment, but also in Schönberg in Berlin, where I saw this, the city used to plant trees down the streets and flower beds and planter boxes and things, and it ran out of money. It's just stopped doing that. And then people on the street started doing it themselves. And actually it's turned out to be a better solution in a sense in terms of making a vibrant streets, because you get this wonderful pattern of different flowers outside every different apartment block. Each block takes care of it. Some plant herbs, some plant vegetables, some plant flowers and so on. So you get this diversity up and down the street, which speaks of the diversity of the city, the identity of the city. If the municipality had done it, it would have been the same tree every 10 meters, which wouldn't have spoken actually to the diversity of that community at all. So the emergence of this civic economy isn't just a failure of the state necessarily to say we ran out of money, but actually could be an opportunity if we think, what scale does the decision have to be made at? Is the scale of a decision a tree outside an apartment block? Is that something that the municipality needs to engage in deeply? Probably not. If it's Gorky Park, of course, because it's a big decision that's there for a long time, so it needs careful management. But a more fine-grained sense of decision-making and applying that to the fine grain of green space outside of this idea of the park, that could be a very interesting possibility and a creative possibility and systemic to your question.
Ну, вот на этой берлинской истории я предлагаю заканчивать.
So I suggest that we conclude our session on this Berlin example, and I would like to please pardon me for the fact that I didn't have a chance to give you all an opportunity to speak, but I would like to thank you all for taking part in this discussion, and thank you very much.